We're going to move from elite women to very ordinary women and talk about how they're presented in ballads. Why ballads? Because, well, they were everywhere in early modern and 19th century Europe, and I should stress that I'm going to talk about the 19th century as well. In every language in Europe, the news of high-profile events was put into verse, printed on cheap paper, and hawked in the street by singers. Ballads were, in most European languages, set to familiar tunes. So anyone with the lyrics, whatever their education, age, gender, socioeconomic level, could sing along. And street singers were a ubiquitous sight in busy streets and marketplaces. The news categories were similar to those of today: politics, military encounters, natural disasters, and what concerns us here today, crime and punishment. Songs about people being executed were one of the most popular products from the beginning of print, right up until they stopped executing people in public. Here is someone being executed at Tyburn in London in the 18th century, with the ballad seller, that woman, right front and centre. And when the person being executed was a woman, the crime and therefore the ballad about it demanded everyone's attention. So today I want to give a brief overview of early modern 19th century infanticide ballads, songs about women being executed for murdering their newborn babies, thinking in particular about how maternity is depicted within them. Given that, like modern news, ballads tended to misrepresent actual levels of crime by foregrounding those that were seen as sensational because of the gender of the protagonists, and given the increasingly draconian legislation against this crime in early modern Europe, there should have been a veritable deluge of these songs. What I found when I went to look for them surprised me. So although neonatal infanticide, which is the murder of a newborn, had always been a prevalent phenomenon, there had been across Europe until the 16th century some leniency afforded to those who found themselves in this situation, especially given the difficulty of distinguishing between a stillbirth and a murdered newborn. However, the 16th century saw the beginning of a distinct rise in legislation specifically targeting this crime, directed only at women, specifically unmarried mothers, and often with criteria for evidence that would today be considered circumstantial. So, neonatal infanticide was conceived of both in the popular imagination and in legislation as a discrete category from the category of homicide, and legislation prescribed different kinds of punishments for that crime. In 1532, the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, the first body of German criminal law that covered the whole of the Holy Roman Empire, defined infanticide as when a woman who secretly maliciously and willfully kills her child, which had both life and body, after carrying that child secretly. And then she gives birth without the help of other women. So secrecy is a big one here. Punishment was the death penalty, either by live burial or by drowning. Although in reality, those severe and highly dishonourable means of punishment, of execution, weren't usually used. Most women were convicted of infanticide were decapitated by sword. In the Netherlands, women convicted of infanticide were also accused of witchcraft, and these executions were therefore given added punishments, such as being impaled or buried alive. In 1556, the French state issued an edict forcing women to make official statements of pregnancy, déclaration de la grossesse, at local registries. If they did not do so and then delivered a dead child, they could be charged with murder. And, if you think about the rates of infant mortality, it's really quite risky here. Those new laws were reinforced in separate edicts in 1680 and 1708. It's obviously, I'm a witch. In Scotland, the Act Against Child Murder was passed in 1690, which described 3 conditions that were to be taken as proof that the mother had deliberately murdered her own child: concealing the pregnancy, giving birth alone, and having no living child to show one's neighbour. So even without a corpse, or with a corpse that showed no sign of injury, juries were ordered to presume guilt based on these circumstantial criteria. The Scottish Act was based in large part on the earlier English Act of 1624, the Act to prevent the destroying and murdering of bastard children. So immediately that idea that this is about being married, unmarried women do this, also known as the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act. This act specifically referred to single women who gave birth and then secretly hid the body and claimed that it was born dead. It claimed they were lewd women, this is in the act, lewd women who committed the crime to avoid their shame and escape punishment. If there was no other witness to prove that the child had been born dead, then the woman would be assumed guilty of murdering that child. In other words, in the eyes of authorities, these young women were sexually promiscuous, filled with both lust and an unnatural rage, that word unnatural comes up again and again, that made them kill their children out of cruelty, not out of, the fear of shame, etc. Although overall there doesn't seem to have ever been any epidemic of infanticide, across Europe the trend is that prosecutions for infanticide were more vigorous in the period immediately after the introduction of the new legislation. In England, Laura Spence found that from the implementation of the Act to 1688, infanticide cases within the counties of Sussex and Kent more than doubled. The conviction rate was also high. 53% of women accused were then found guilty, and 86% of those women went on to be executed. In France, from roughly 1565 to 1690, the period after the edicts were passed, 2/3 of the women condemned to death by the Parlement of Paris were infanticides. And the proportion of death sentences for infanticide among all death sentences varied from 18% to as high as 34%. These are extraordinary figures. It was easy to convict when only circumstantial evidence was required. In Geneva, from 1595 to 1712, 25 women out of 31 charged with infanticide were executed, a higher rate of convictions than for witchcraft. But this trend appears to have been limited to the period immediately subsequent to the legislation's introduction, and there is convincing evidence, new research covering Italy, France and Switzerland, that there was, in the words of Julie Hardwick, communal complicity, where communities worked to manage and cover up unwanted children and infanticides, avoiding arrest and prosecution entirely. Sarah Beam has shown that in 17th century Geneva, the authorities would convict infanticide within the city walls, but were happy to turn a blind eye to women who left the city to give birth and then returned to act as wet nurses. Yeah, so the elite women are looked after. Moreover, by the middle decades of the 18th century, the emergence of new rules of evidence, doubts around the reliability of the medical evidence, and in particular, a growing disbelief in the ability of women to murder their own children meant that juries were reluctant to convict women accused of neonatal infanticide, and most of the legislation would be repealed by the early 19th century. These legislative transformations didn't equate to a decrease in concern about infanticide. In fact, the 19th century saw an increase in official and public anxiety about infanticide, along with concerns about illegitimacy and sexual morality, always. Tim Siddons notes that commentators in Britain in the 1860s and 1870s worried about an epidemic of infanticide. The Harveyan Society on Infanticide, the actually big Guinness Society, concluded in 1867 that the evil that the number of illegitimate births represented was unhappily an increasing one, and suggested sweeping measures to tackle it, intriguingly suggesting a reduction of the punishment from infanticide from execution to imprisonment. So one might reasonably expect that Ballads would reflect the authorities' concern around what was perceived to be a growing problem, and Ballads would have flourished during the period in which so many women were being executed. But as Anne-Marie Kildea summarises in her survey of infanticide in Britain from 1600 to the present, there was seemingly a disjuncture between contemporary disquiet about the frequency and nature of the crime of infanticide on the one hand, and the judicial reality of how accused women might be treated on the other. So everyone was upset at how common this crime was, but they didn't necessarily think that young women should be executed for it. Which means that despite the Europe-wide trend by state authorities to punish women, there's a surprising dearth of ballads around about specific executions for this crime. Now, while there are multiple well-known traditional ballads, by which I mean ballads that don't claim any kind of historical or to refer to a specific legal case, and there are also plenty of printed prose accounts, I have found across 4 centuries and 5 languages only a small handful of ballads that document specific historical cases of executions of women convicted of neonatal infanticide. The majority of these refer to 19th century cases when the legislation is being eased and the conviction rates are dropping. So one would expect more songs during the what Alfred Soman calls the infanticide craze from the late 16th through the mid-18th centuries, when execution rates are at their highest. That period shows the least survival. Why? How can that be explained, given that women who killed were always a lucrative topic for crime ballads, and these victims were, of course, the most vulnerable in society? So the answers might be found in the portrayal of infanticide in the songs that do exist, which tend to reflect official concerns rather than the tolerant attitudes of communities who regularly dealt with young, unmarried, pregnant women. Upon closer examination of the ballads, there are some frequent themes that tally with the authorities' depiction of neonatal infanticide. First, the crime scene is overwhelmingly the mother's fault. The pregnancy is the result of her evil libertinage. The father is usually not discussed. Often she simply becomes a mother without any mention of a sexual partner. Even when he is mentioned as an accomplice to the murder, which is quite common, and punished equally to her, that could happen as well, the mention is only brief. The focus remains on the woman's sins, motives, and punishment. Second, the songs are more likely than in other crimes to be in the first-person voice of the condemned, even in German ballads, which is especially rare and thus noteworthy. Execution ballads can very often be found in the first-person voice of the condemned, who sings from the scaffold, about their problems, but almost never in German, except for infanticide ones. So the first-person voice commands greater identification with the criminal and would therefore be effective in warning off young women from potentially ruinous pregnancies. And third, the woman is often anonymous, another rarity to know who this person is who's being executed. This anonymity changes in certain regions once we approach the 19th century. But the ballad's conservative, judgmental tone about women whom communities felt to be highly vulnerable is likely why they knew little success and why so few remain. So we're limited for time, so I'll only give a brief summary of the findings in languages other than English, and then we'll move to the English ones. So Dutch, of the 175,000 digitized ballads in the Dutch song database, I found only 2 that claim to be about genuine historical cases of prosecuted infanticide. There's plenty of traditional songs that make no claim to historical accuracy. Both are in the first-person voice of the condemned. Only one names the woman, Catharine van Wyk, hanged in Amsterdam in 1711. The song mentions that she will undergo a posthumous punishment. After she's hanged, her corpse will be dragged on a hurdle, which is a sort of a thinly woven mat, to the gallows field, the execution site outside the city, where it will be placed on a pole, a reference to the display of criminal corpses on cartwheels hoisted up on high. Really very shameful punishment that would have reflected on her family. In German, I've only 2 ballads about neonatal infanticide from the 17th century, none for the 16th century, when the punishment stipulations were being put to greatest effect. When German songs exist about identifiable women, they lack a condemnatory perspective. Although Margaretha Lehrerin, convicted of murdering her newborn twin boys in 1690, blames her lust for her pregnancy, so my evil mind seduced me that I followed the carnal lust, and her hard heart for their deaths, she's entirely repented. Oh, woe to me that I've become a murderess. I've murdered my flesh and blood. The song is filled with imagery of remorse and redemption. Even the 2 songs about Anna Henkin, broken on the wheel for infanticide in 1800, paint her as tempted by the devil, and he comes around a lot. She is ultimately remorseful. Breaking on the wheel was an extremely rare punishment for women. It's horrific. So evidently the authorities found her crimes particularly heinous, but the verses about her offer a contrasting perspective. In French, there's only one French song that dates from the period following the major edicts, the lament and regret of a young girl for having killed her own child from 1606. In this first-person song, she claims that instead of marrying her parents' choice of suitor, she allowed lust to get the better of her and blames fairly equally Satan, Cupid, and a young lawyer for her pregnancy. She murders the baby mercilessly with an axe and throws it in the privy, so there's that cruelty. Whereupon her mother finds it and turns her into the authorities. She suffers a similar fate to her counterparts in the German lands. This is another thing that could happen to you. The court ordered that I should have my 2 hands cut off and my breasts torn off because I'd well deserved it. This de-breasting with burning tongs while en route to execution was one of those extra methods of punishment that could be applied to any criminal whose crimes were judged heinous enough, male or female. But it seems that in certain regions to have been particularly applied to women convicted of infanticide. The punishment is designed to mark her out as unnatural, living in contrast to the expectations of femininity, both through her promiscuity and her murderous rage. The other 4 French songs that I have date from the second half of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century, a time when juries are reluctant to send young women to their deaths. But the depictions of the young women as licentious, duplicitous, and violent continue. So there's only one ballad from England in the period after the 1624 Act, No Natural Mother But a Monster, composed by the celebrity ballad writer Martin Parker, is in the voice of an unnamed young woman in Braintree in Essex who in December 1633 gave birth in secret. There was no woman then near to assist me, she says, whereupon she hid her newborn in straw. Upon the discovery, she was hanged at Tyburn. Although the ballad makes multiple references to the cruelty that brings women to murder their newborns, it's in fact not overwhelmingly condemnatory of the girl. She's depicted as alone and desperate and repeatedly mentions the fear of shame that drives her to commit the act. And we find that sympathy in Scottish ballads too. Infanticide is a regular topic of Scottish traditional ballads, such as Mary Hamilton. And if you haven't heard Joan Baez sing Mary Hamilton, well, get the Kleenex, it's the most saddest song in the whole world. That song occurs in more variations than any other Scottish ballad, which is an extraordinary stat. The existence of so many traditional ballads on infanticide in Scotland might at first lead us to assume that the Scottish were harsher in their judgment of women, and they often were. But Jean Friedman argues that Scots ballads, like Greek tragedy, exist not to provide a sum of shared values, but instead to articulate conflicts that arise from unshared values. And in doing so, the ballads suggest solutions, air grievances, and perhaps defuse or detonate these conflicts by changing them from reality to representation. And I think that's a really, really excellent way to think about through these, that this isn't about, this is how we all agree that this is the right thing. We don't. And the ballads about genuine executions walk this precarious line between condemnation and sympathy, such as the song about the execution of Janet Riddle in Edinburgh in 1702. While the ballad in Riddle's voice sings that the laws cannot be too severe for such a crime, it nevertheless makes mention of one of the frequent actions undertaken by many of the young women who murdered their infants, which reveal a tenderness and sympathy for the newly dead child, leaving a token, such as an identifiable piece of clothing or wrapping it up. Riddle sings that she attempted to place the dead child in a soft bed of feathers. This being done with little grace, where I might lay the child, I did contrive for it a place, which when alive was mild. 'Mong feathers then the bab I laid, with silence great I lay, and being dead it bleeding stayed, which twixt my sides long lie. So that final line, which twixt my sides long lie, it's lain within my body for a long time, repeated in almost all the verses, reminds listeners of the long physical relationship Riddle would have had with her growing fetus, which arguably subverts the ostensible message in the early lines of the ballad that Riddle is unnatural and filled with grievous cruelty. Instead, she rightly fears, "Least any person should me scorn, and church be too severe." The ballad reminds its listeners of the impossible situation faced by an unmarried woman who found herself pregnant in early modern Scotland. The shame and stigma from both the community and the kirk was enough to drive many to murder their own children. The situation shifted somewhat in the 19th century, when alongside the growing calls for leniency in cases of young women murdering their newborns, there was a concurrent rise in songs about them. The example of Margaret Bell, sentenced to death for infanticide in Paisley in the 19th century, offers some evidence to support Friedman's idea of unshared values. Two ballads are composed about Bell. The first concentrates on Bell's tortured emotional state, crying and trying to comfort her child in the cold. Cold was the night of the 16th of November, as straight with my child close pressed to my breast. My bosom was swelling, my tears fast were falling, as hush, hush, I cried, to lull my baby to rest. By the croft head bleach field I careless did wander, to the edge of the pond where I thought none did see. There I murdered my babe, and threw it in the water, for which I must die upon the gallows tree. But that was not to happen. The people of Paisley petitioned the Crown for mitigation of her sentence, and Margaret Bell was transported, probably to Australia. The second song, set to the mournful, poignant tune Braes of Strathblane, becomes a song of warning to young women of false-hearted suitors. It also reveals how popular culture depicted the mental state of a young unmarried woman forced into killing her newborn. That perfidious young man, the cause of my pain, for he was the first that brought me to shame, the cause of my misery and sad poverty, which causes me now a poor convict to be. When my child was born, I was in poverty's grasp, and adversity blew with her cold, bitter blast, while he proved false that I loved so well. The mind became frantic of poor Margaret Bell. My sad situation, naught but misery in my view, and he proving false that vowed to be true, I could see no way for me but beg, starve, or steal, and Satan whispered to me, "Your baby go kill." I was tried and found guilty of base cruelty, and received my sentence to die on a tree. But the people in and round Paisley did much for me, and petitions is forwarded to the Queen's Majesty. Now all you good people that took my cause in hand, I think on your kindness when in a foreign land, for with grateful sensations my bosom does swell, accept the humble thanks of poor Margaret Bell. So while people, and especially women, might have wanted to sing traditional ballads about the impossible choices faced by young women in a time of sexual double standards and a culture of shame around illegitimate pregnancies, there doesn't seem to have been an appetite for songs about identifiable women, or if they were identified by name, the songs in most regions did not treat them as the scheming, lustful monsters that the legislation explicitly stated them to be. Songs existed that conform to the official depiction of infanticide as evil, debauched, and duplicitous, but they usually don't identify an individual, and they act therefore as exemplars or warnings rather than news. While ballads about crimes, especially murder, committed by women, were normally a lucrative printing venture, and I can say more about ballads about murderous midwives and baby farmers, nowhere does there seem to have been an explosion of printed songs about the multiple executions of infanticides by mothers that the courts were processing in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Ironically, it was in the 19th century that certain regions, particularly France and Italy, started to produce more songs depicting these young women as duplicitous, rage-filled murderers, precisely at the moment when the legislation against them was being relaxed. And I can talk more about why France and Italy are an outlier here. In most places, though, ballads depict these young women as sympathetic creatures placed in an impossible situation and made frantic and remorseful at the murders they feel forced to commit. I'll leave it there. Thank you.